The air on Zyphar 7 was thick with static, a prelude to the incoming storm that loomed on the horizon like a monstrous, swirling beast. The planet's crimson sky darkened as layers of dust swirled in the distance, forming an ominous curtain of chaos. The heat was oppressive, pressing down on everything with an almost suffocating weight. Yet, despite the approaching danger, the students gathered outside the research dome, their sleek metallic suits reflecting the harsh sunlight. They stood in a semicircle, their elongated figures tense with barely contained amusement as they focused on the lone human standing before them. Don Ross, the only human in the Zephyrian Engineering Exchange program, adjusted his utility belt and wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow. The air was dry, making every breath feel like inhaling hot sand. Despite this, his posture remained steady, his expression neutral, though he was well aware of the skepticism radiating from his peers. The murmurs among them grew louder, barely masked by a feigned politeness. "This should be entertaining," one of the students, Krizal, whispered to his companion, his voice vibrating with the distinctive trilling resonance of his species. Dr. Velkor, the leading expert in xenoconstruction and the professor overseeing the course, stepped forward. His presence alone was enough to command absolute attention. He was taller than the students, his ridged forehead casting a sharp shadow over his deep-set eyes. His arms were crossed, his expression one of cool detachment, as if the very premise of today's lesson was beneath him. "As you all know," he began, his voice smooth yet laced with condescension, "we are here today to settle a rather amusing debate. Our human participant, Don Ross, insists that primitive construction techniques, those involving no advanced energy fields, no automated nanomaterials, no reinforced molecular barriers, can withstand the natural forces of IFAR 7, a claim that, I need not remind you, defies centuries of established architectural principles." A few students exchanged glances, their faces betraying mild amusement. Don knew that to them he was little more than an anomaly, a curiosity that had somehow stumbled into their world of hyper-advanced technology. Dr. Velkor gestured toward the barren landscape behind him. "The storm, as you can see, is already forming. Within 6 hours it will reach this location. By then, Ross is expected to have completed his shelter, using only materials found in the environment." The murmurs grew louder, some of the students barely containing their laughter. One of them, a particularly smug-looking Zypharian named Relos, raised his elongated fingers, his bioluminescent markings glowing faintly. "Professor, with all due respect, how is this even a fair demonstration? Our own shelters are built with quantum-stabilized force barriers. How does one compete with that using, what, sticks and stones?" A ripple of laughter spread through the group. Even Dr. Velkor allowed a small smirk to touch his lips before continuing. "Indeed, Relos, the comparison is almost absurd. However, our human friend here is quite determined, and so, let us humor him." Don clenched his jaw but refused to react. He had anticipated their mockery. Let them laugh. He was here to prove something, not just to them, but to himself. Dr. Velkor extended an arm, indicating a vast expanse of jagged rock formations and clusters of resilient, wiry vegetation that managed to survive in the planet's brutal conditions. "Your materials are whatever you can gather. You have 6 hours. Begin." With that, the group of students turned toward their own project, a sleek, gleaming shelter already forming through the synchronized efforts of their floating construction drones. The energy field flickered around its base, humming with a quiet, controlled power. Don, on the other hand, was entirely alone. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. The landscape stretched before him, vast and unyielding. He strode forward, scanning the area for the best possible location. The key to surviving any storm wasn't just the structure itself, it was placement. He had read the topographical maps earlier that morning and noted a small rock outcrop that could serve as a natural windbreak. With the storm approaching from the west, positioning the shelter behind this formation would reduce the direct impact of the winds. He moved quickly, his boots crunching against the cracked, reddish soil. Every step sent small puffs of dust into the air, mixing with the heavy scent of minerals. He reached the outcrop and ran his fingers over the stone. It was solid, hard enough to withstand the winds without crumbling. That was good. He took a mental note before turning his attention to gathering material. There were no trees on Zephyr 7, but there were clusters of fibrous plants with thick, sinewy roots that clung desperately to the soil. He knelt down and yanked at one, testing its strength. It was tough, interwoven, and flexible, perfect for binding. He pulled several strands free and coiled them at his side before moving on. The next challenge was finding a sturdy enough frame. There were plenty of jagged rock formations, but he needed pieces he could actually manipulate. His gaze fell on a nearby slope, where the shifting winds had eroded parts of the terrain, leaving behind large, relatively flat slabs of stone. He set to work, using a makeshift lever, an old trick from survival training. To pry the slabs free, it was grueling, sweat-drenched work, and his muscles ached with each movement. Meanwhile, the alien students occasionally glanced his way, their expressions a mixture of amusement and curiosity. Their own shelter was already halfway finished, its sleek, glowing exterior forming a seamless, impenetrable shell. Don ignored them. He had to move fast. The temperature was dropping slightly, another sign that the storm was inching closer. He dragged the stone slabs back to his chosen spot, carefully angling them against the rock outcrop. The goal was to create a structure that wouldn't resist the wind, but rather channel it away, dispersing its force instead of absorbing it head-on. He worked methodically, layering the slabs at an angle and reinforcing the joints with the fibrous plant material. He weaved the fibers tightly, creating a lattice structure that would hold even under intense pressure. He dug into the ground, forming an anchor trench for additional support. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. Don barely noticed, his focus entirely on his task. His hands were raw, his muscles screamed in protest, but he pressed on. Finally, as the last piece was set in place, he took a step back, breathing heavily. His shelter was no marvel of technology, no gleaming fortress of energy and quantum engineering. It was simple, built with his own hands using only the planet's natural resources, and yet it stood firm. The alien students had long since finished their own work. Their shelter glowed with an otherworldly luminescence, pulsing with quiet energy. Some of them had taken to lounging nearby, watching Don with thinly veiled amusement. Dr. Velcor approached, his sharp gaze sweeping over the human's creation. His expression remained unreadable. "Well," he said, crossing his arms, "I suppose we shall see soon enough." Don exhaled slowly and turned his gaze to the horizon. The storm was nearly upon them now, a swirling mass of sand and chaos devouring the sky. He could feel the first tendrils of wind whipping against his face, carrying with them the promise of destruction. He squared his shoulders. Let the storm come. Don stood beside his unfinished shelter, the wind beginning to pick up around him. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain of Zephyr 7. His muscles ached from hauling the heavy stone slabs, but he knew there was still much to do. The storm would arrive within a few hours, and if his shelter wasn't reinforced properly, all his effort would be for nothing. He took a deep breath and ran a quick assessment of what remained to be done. The base was stable, angled against the wind in a way that should help deflect some of the force. The fibrous plant bindings were holding the slabs together, but he needed to add a secondary layer of reinforcement. If one stone shifted during the storm, the entire structure could collapse. His fingers traced along the seams where the stones met. There were small gaps, and though they were not large enough to compromise the integrity of the structure immediately, he knew that wind-driven sand would find a way through. The particles on Zephyr 7 were fine and sharp, capable of grinding away at weaker materials over time. He needed something to seal the gaps. His gaze flicked toward the dried clay patches further down the slope. Earlier, he had noticed how the ground near the ridge had retained moisture, creating a thick layer of cracked clay. That would be his answer. If he could mix it with some of the fibrous plant material and apply it to the gaps, it would harden as it dried, forming a solid barrier. He moved quickly, jogging toward the ridge where the clay deposits lay. The air had taken on an eerie stillness, the kind that preceded violent weather. His footsteps crunched over loose rocks as he crouched down and dug his fingers into the clay. It was tougher than he expected, but as he broke it apart, he found the softer, more pliable layers beneath. He gathered as much as he could carry, pressing it into a makeshift container fashioned from a large piece of split rock. When he returned to the shelter, he placed the clay near the base of the structure and retrieved several more bundles of plant fibers. Using a flat stone, he ground the fibers into smaller strands, then mixed them with the clay, kneading the material together until it formed a thick, malleable paste. He worked quickly, pressing the mixture into the gaps between the stone slabs. His hands moved with precision, pushing the clay deep into the crevices before smoothing it over with his fingers. The wind had picked up slightly, and he could feel the temperature dropping further. He needed to finish soon. Across the clearing, the Xipharian students observed him with mild curiosity. Their own shelter had been completed long ago, its smooth, metallic surface shimmering beneath the dimming sky. Don knew they thought his efforts were a waste of time. He kept his focus on his work. The clay mixture hardened faster than expected, forming a surprisingly solid barrier along the seams. Satisfied that the structure was now sealed against the elements, he turned his attention to the final reinforcement: the interior supports. Stepping inside, he crouched down and examined the narrow space. It wasn't large, just enough room for him to sit with his back against the stone wall. He needed to brace the walls from within to prevent any sudden shifts. He retrieved several smaller stones from the area nearby and began wedging them between the larger slabs, locking them into place. Each stone was positioned carefully, ensuring that any force from the storm would be evenly distributed instead of concentrating on a single weak point. The last piece was the entrance. He had left a narrow opening just large enough for him to crawl through, but if he didn't secure it properly, the wind could tear into the structure and destabilize everything. He found a flat piece of rock and positioned it over the entrance at an angle, leaving just enough of a gap to allow airflow while blocking the majority of the wind. As he stepped back to examine his work, he exhaled slowly. The shelter was finished. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't beautiful, but it was functional. More importantly, it was strong. The sky had darkened significantly, the distant clouds rolling toward them with an almost sentient determination. The Xipharian students had begun retreating into their shelter, their movements casual, unhurried. Don felt a sharp gust of wind whip past him, carrying with it the first traces of sand. The storm was arriving faster than anticipated. He didn't have time to second-guess his work. He took one final look at his shelter before ducking inside, pulling the entrance stone into place behind him. Inside, the space was tight, the air already feeling cooler. He pressed his back against the stone and listened. Outside, the wind began to howl. The first impact struck with a force that sent a deep, shuddering vibration through the ground. Inside the cramped confines of the shelter, Don braced himself against the stone wall, his fingers instinctively pressing against the rough surface. The sound of the wind outside escalated from an eerie whistle to a deafening roar, carrying with it the sharp staccato of sand and debris pelting against the shelter's exterior. The temperature dropped rapidly. Even with the tight construction of his walls, cold air seeped through the few remaining gaps, making his breath visible in the dim light. He adjusted his position, trying to find the most stable posture in the limited space. His back pressed firmly against one of the larger support slabs, feeling every tremor as the storm battered the land outside. The wind howled, shifting in pitch as it found new angles to exploit. He could hear the violent currents twisting through the valley, hammering against rock formations and sending loose stones skittering across the ground. The force was relentless. as though the storm itself was testing every structure in its path. He reached out, placing his hand against the floor, feeling the way the vibrations traveled through the stone. It was a method he had learned during survival training, understanding the storm through its movement rather than just its sound. If the tremors became sporadic or sharp, it would mean structural instability in the terrain itself. For now, the shaking was rhythmic, the shelter absorbing the brunt of the wind's fury rather than resisting it outright. A sudden impact sent a sharp crack reverberating through the shelter. His pulse spiked and he instinctively ducked lower, his heart pounding as he assessed the damage. The sound had come from above. Something heavy had struck the outer surface. He held his breath, listening carefully. A few seconds passed, then another thud, this one lighter but still distinct. Rocks, dislodged by the storm, were beginning to rain down from the ridgeline. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. The roof of his shelter was angled for this exact reason, to deflect debris rather than take the full force of each impact. He had reinforced the top with interlocking stones, ensuring that a single hit wouldn't compromise the structure. He had to trust that his design would hold. Outside, the wind screamed louder. Sand blasted against the entrance slab, forcing some of the finer particles through the narrow gap. He pulled his scarf over his mouth and nose, shielding himself from the dust. Even in his tight enclosure, the storm was trying to find a way in. Time passed in agonizing increments. The relentless force outside showed no signs of weakening. He imagined the Xipherian students in their shelter, sitting comfortably within their sleek, technology-driven structure, completely detached from the raw violence of the storm. Their force fields would be flickering with energy, creating a perfect bubble of safety around them. Another impact. This time it was followed by a low, grinding sound. His muscles tensed as he realized what was happening. The winds were shifting, causing larger boulders to slide along the ridge. If a rock of significant size rolled onto his shelter, it could create enough pressure to collapse part of the structure. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying his breathing. There was nothing he could do from inside. The design of the shelter was built to withstand external pressure, but if nature decided to test it beyond its limits, he would have to react in real time. The grinding continued, then suddenly stopped. His fingers dug into the dirt beneath him as he strained to hear past the howling wind. Then, a massive crack echoed through the valley, followed by a deep, reverberating thud. His stomach twisted. That had been a rock slide. Not just small debris, something large had broken free. He felt the impact through the ground, a powerful tremor that sent dust cascading from the ceiling of his shelter. He gritted his teeth, pressing his back harder against the wall, trying to gauge whether his structure had taken a direct hit. Silence stretched between the gusts of wind. The storm hadn't ended, but something had shifted. He tilted his head slightly, listening past the raging winds. In the distance, through the chaotic noise, he heard something unexpected. Shouting. His eyes snapped open. It was faint, almost drowned out by the storm, but the distinct cadence of panicked voices carried through the wind. His heartbeat quickened. The Xipherian students? He pressed his ear against the stone wall, trying to make out words. The voices were distorted, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear. Something had gone wrong. He hesitated for only a second before shifting toward the entrance. His shelter was holding. He had built it to last, and so far it had done exactly that. The real question now was what had happened to the others. With careful, deliberate movements, he reached for the entrance slab and tested its weight. The wind pushed against it, making it heavier than before, but he managed to pry it open just enough to peer outside. A wall of dust greeted him, thick and impenetrable. The wind was still fierce, making visibility nearly impossible beyond a few meters. He squinted against the onslaught of sand, trying to make out anything beyond the swirling chaos. Then he saw it. The Xipherian shelter, or what was left of it. The once pristine structure, with its shimmering force barriers and smooth exterior, had been compromised. Large cracks ran along its surface, flickering with unstable energy. Sections of the protective field had collapsed entirely, leaving jagged gaps where the storm had torn through. A group of students huddled near the entrance, their elongated forms barely visible through the dust. One of them was struggling against the wind, reaching toward the failing structure, while another pulled him back. Don exhaled sharply. Their shelter wasn't going to hold. Another wave of wind surged through the valley, forcing him to brace himself against the entrance. He had two choices: stay inside, safe within the structure he had built, or go out there and help. He didn't hesitate. Gritting his teeth, he pulled the entrance stone fully aside, forcing his way into the storm. The moment Don stepped out of his shelter, the storm hit him like a living force, a relentless wall of wind and sand tearing at his exposed skin. He staggered forward, planting his feet firmly to keep his balance as the gale howled around him. The dust was so thick that it blurred everything into a swirling haze, reducing visibility to mere meters. He shielded his face with his arm, blinking against the sharp sting of airborne debris as he pushed forward. Ahead, the Xipherian shelter continued to deteriorate, its once pristine force fields flickering erratically. The failing energy barrier pulsed weakly, no longer able to hold back the brutal force of the storm. The cracks in the structure widened with each gust of wind, sections of the metallic plating peeling away like brittle leaves in a wildfire. The students clung to one another, their elongated limbs wrapped tightly around their bodies in a desperate attempt to resist the storm's fury. Don could see the panic in their movements. One of them, Relos, was trying to force his way back toward the shelter, reaching for the unstable support beams as if he could somehow reinforce them with sheer willpower. Another student, Crizzle, yanked at his arm, trying to pull him away. The wind tore at them both, forcing them to stumble as the ground beneath them shifted unpredictably. Don gritted his teeth and forced himself to move faster. Every step was a battle against the wind, his boots sinking slightly into the loose sand with each motion. The storm roared in his ears, a deafening cacophony that drowned out everything except the furious rhythm of his own heartbeat. As he neared the group, he saw Dr. Velcor further back, standing stiffly against the wind. The professor's ridged forehead was partially covered in dust, his normally composed features tight with tension. His gaze was locked onto the failing shelter, his body rigid as though he were mentally calculating every structural failure in real time. He wasn't moving. Whether out of shock or resignation, Don couldn't tell. A sudden crack split through the air, louder than the storm itself. A section of the Xipherian shelter gave way entirely, sending a large slab of metallic plating tumbling toward the ground. It missed Relos by mere inches, slamming into the dirt with enough force to send a shockwave of sand outward. The impact jolted Relos into awareness, and he finally stopped struggling against Chrysal's grip. Don reached them just as another surge of wind blasted through the valley, nearly knocking him off his feet. He grabbed onto Relos's arm, anchoring him against the storm. "Move!" Don shouted over the wind, his voice barely carrying through the chaos. "Your shelter is going to collapse." Raylo's eyes, normally filled with an air of superiority, were wide with disbelief. His bioluminescent markings flickered in distress, a telltale sign of his species' heightened emotional state. "But Relos," began, his voice raw with hesitation. "No time," Don snapped. He turned to Chryzal. "Get the others, now." Chryzal hesitated only for a second before nodding sharply and turning toward the remaining students. He gestured frantically, his movements urgent as he called for them to retreat. Don didn't wait to see if they followed orders. He tightened his grip on Relos's arm and started pulling him toward his own shelter. The wind fought against them, dragging at their bodies with invisible hands, but Don pressed forward, his muscles burning from the effort. Behind him, the Xipherian shelter gave another ominous groan. He risked a glance over his shoulder just in time to see a second section of the roof give way, the metallic structure folding inward as though crushed by an unseen force. The energy barrier sputtered once more before vanishing entirely, leaving nothing between the students and the merciless storm. Dr. Velcor finally snapped out of his trance and turned toward the others. His voice, though barely audible over the wind, carried enough authority to spur the remaining students into motion. Don reached his shelter first, practically shoving Relos inside before turning back. Kreisel and 2 other students followed, their bodies hunched against the wind as they scrambled through the narrow entrance. Another crash split the air as the last remnants of the Xipherian structure collapsed entirely, sending a plume of dust skyward. Only Dr. Velcor remained outside. He stood motionless for a moment longer, staring at the wreckage of the shelter he had so confidently declared superior. Then, with a sharp inhale, he turned and moved toward Don's structure, stepping inside just as another blast of wind tore through the valley. Inside the shelter, the sudden shift in atmosphere was jarring. The howling wind was reduced to a muffled roar, the walls holding firm against the storm's relentless assault. The students huddled together, their usual poised demeanor replaced with unmistakable unease. Relos, still breathless from the sprint, looked around at the cramped space, his bioluminescent markings dimming. His gaze flicked to Don, lingering on the solid walls of interlocked stone slabs. He reached out hesitantly, pressing a hand against the surface as if expecting it to crumble beneath his touch. When it held firm, his expression shifted from skepticism to something else. Something Don couldn't quite place. Dr. Velcor, now covered in a fine layer of dust, surveyed the interior with narrowed eyes. His calculating mind was no doubt already dissecting every element of the structure, searching for its weaknesses. Yet, for all his analysis, the shelter remained intact. Kreisel broke the silence first. "It's holding." His voice was quiet, as though he didn't fully believe his own words. Don exhaled sharply, finally allowing himself a moment to breathe. He leaned back against the stone, letting the exhaustion settle into his limbs. The shelter had done exactly what it was built to do. It had protected him. And now, it had protected them. The realization seemed to dawn on the Xipherian students all at once. Their gazes shifted uneasily between one another, their postures subtly adjusting as the weight of the situation sank in. They had mocked him, ridiculed his methods, but when their own technology had failed, it was his primitive, human-built structure that had saved them. Dr. Velcor folded his arms, his expression unreadable. He remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "This," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "was unexpected." Don let out a breathless chuckle, the absurdity of the situation finally hitting him. He ran a hand through his dust-coated hair, shaking his head. "Yeah," he muttered. "Tell me about it." The storm raged on outside, but inside, Don's shelter stood strong. The storm howled outside, relentless in its fury, but inside the shelter there was silence. The Xipherian students sat huddled together, their elongated bodies tense, their bioluminescent markings dim to a dull glow. The close quarters forced them into unfamiliar proximity, their usually poised and detached mannerisms stripped away by the raw reality of survival. The only sound, apart from the muffled roar of the wind, was the shallow breathing of those inside. Don remained by the entrance, his back pressed against the rough stone wall, his muscles aching from exertion. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the uneven surface of the shelter, feeling every groove and imperfection that had, against all odds, held strong against nature's assault. He glanced toward Dr. Velcor, who sat rigidly near the center of the space, his sharp eyes scanning the interior with unreadable intensity. No one spoke at first. The weight of their predicament still lingered, as if acknowledging it aloud would somehow make it worse. Eventually, Relos broke the silence, his voice strained but steady. "We should not be alive," he said, his bioluminescent markings flickering faintly. "That shelter, it was supposed to withstand anything." Kreisel shifted uncomfortably, his fingers flexing against his knees. "It was supposed to be superior." His words carried less arrogance than before, the usual confidence in his tone now replaced with uncertainty. Dr. Velcor exhaled sharply, his eyes narrowing as he finally addressed them. "It was superior," he said, though there was no conviction behind his words. He paused before continuing. On paper. Don let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head. Guess the storm didn't read your blueprints. Relos turned his gaze toward him, his bioluminescence flickering slightly brighter, though whether from irritation or something else Don couldn't tell. You are enjoying this, he accused. Don shrugged. Not exactly, he admitted, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't feeling a little vindicated right now. Dr. Velcor clasped his hands together, his expression unreadable as he studied the human in front of him. You knew it would happen, he stated, though there was no question in his tone, just a quiet, unsettling certainty. Dom shook his head. I didn't know, he corrected. I just planned for the worst. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling where tiny cracks had formed in the dried clay he had used to seal the gaps. You were so focused on technology, on building something strong, that you forgot that strength isn't always about resisting force. Sometimes it's about adapting to it. Dr. Velcor remained silent, his gaze contemplative. The professor was not a man who admitted fault easily, but the evidence was undeniable. Kryzal shifted, rubbing his arms against the cold. Your methods, he began hesitantly, they were inefficient. He hesitated before adding, and yet they worked. Dawn smirked. Inefficient, huh? He gestured toward the intact walls around them. I'll take inefficient over dead any day. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Raylos let out a sharp exhale, something almost resembling laughter. It was short and bitter but unmistakable. You're impossible, he muttered, shaking his head. Dawn grinned. And yet, here we are. The storm raged on, but gradually the tension inside the shelter eased. The students, still shaken, began to relax, if only slightly. They had been humbled, forced to confront the limits of their knowledge. Dr. Velcor adjusted his posture, turning his full attention to Dawn. Your structure, he said slowly. Why did it not collapse? Dawn raised an eyebrow. You really want me to explain it? The professor nodded, though his expression remained stern. I want to understand. Dawn exhaled, stretching out his sore legs. All right, he began. Your shelter was built to resist. You used force fields and rigid materials, assuming that if you made it strong enough it would hold. But storms aren't about force alone, they're about movement. Pressure changes, chaos. He tapped his knuckles against the stone beside him. This wasn't built to resist. The walls aren't rigid. They're angled to guide the wind rather than fight it. The materials are natural, meaning they don't attract as much force from the planet's electromagnetic field. And most importantly, it's anchored properly. Your shelter tried to fight the storm. Mine let it pass. Dr. Velcor was silent for a long time, his mind undoubtedly dissecting every piece of information. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. You anticipated the weaknesses of your own design, he mused. That is unusual. Don tilted his head. It's called survival. The professor studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. Perhaps we underestimated you, Relos scoffed. Perhaps. A faint smirk touched Dr. Velcor's lips. It was brief, but Don caught it. He resisted the urge to gloat. The storm outside finally began to weaken. The wind, once deafening, reduced to a steady howl, and the vibrations against the walls lessened. Don stretched, rolling his shoulders. Sounds like it's dying down. The students shifted, relief evident in their expressions. Kryzal glanced toward the entrance. Will your shelter hold until it's completely over? Don grinned. It's held this long, hasn't it? Minutes passed before the wind finally settled into an uneasy silence. Outside, the world was still, the storm having left its mark in deep dunes of displaced sand and jagged remnants of rock. Dawn was the first to push open the entrance stone, stepping out into the aftermath. The sky was clear again, the twin suns of Zephyr 7 casting a dull golden glow over the landscape. He turned, surveying the ruins of the Zypherian shelter. What remained of it was barely recognizable, a twisted mass of metal and broken panel. Dr. Velcor merged behind him, his sharp eyes scanning the wreckage. He exhaled slowly, folding his arms. "We will rebuild," he said simply. Crizzle stepped beside Dawn, his gaze lingering on the human shelter. "But maybe," he admitted, "next time we'll listen first." Dawn smirked, dusting off his hands. "That's all I ask," Raylo scoffed but said nothing. Dr. Velcor turned toward Dawn, his expression unreadable. "Your methods," he said carefully, "were effective." Dawn raised an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying you were right?" The professor narrowed his eyes slightly, but there was no hostility in his gaze. "It is my way of saying that there is more to learn." Dawn chuckled. "Fair enough." The students, once skeptical, now looked at him differently. He could feel it. Respect. Recognition. Dr. Velcor straightened, dusting off his robes. "Ross," he said, "I would like to discuss your techniques further." Dawn grinned. "You mean you want me to teach you how to build like a primitive?" The professor's lips twitched in the closest thing to amusement Dawn had seen from him. "I mean," he said, "I wish to understand how to survive a storm." Dawn nodded, stretching his arms behind his head. "Well," he said, turning toward the wreckage, "we've got plenty of material to start with." As the suns climbed higher into the sky, the Zephyrians gathered around him, no longer skeptics but students. The lesson was far from over, and this time they were ready to listen.